I am sorry, Mr. Vance, but the 3 offshore Cayman Island trust funds have been legally frozen pending a full federal audit, I said, keeping my voice perfectly professional as I slid the red-stamped documents across the polished marble desk. The man sitting across from me, sweating through his custom Italian suit, stared at the paperwork in absolute, unadulterated terror. He had walked into the premier wealth management firm in the city expecting to quietly move his secret, untaxed millions to a new shell company. He completely failed to recognize that the ruthless senior financial auditor sitting across from him was the exact same daughter he had abandoned in crippling poverty 15 years ago. He thought I was just a faceless corporate entity destroying his perfect, luxurious second life. He had absolutely no idea that this wasn't business. It was a carefully orchestrated 15-year execution. I didn't scream, and I didn't reveal my identity. I just watched the man who broke my mother's heart realize that he was about to lose absolutely everything. My name is Alina, and this is the story of how I let my father build a secret empire built on our stolen funds, only to become the absolute financial authority that legally burned it to the ground. There is a profound, specific kind of trauma that comes from being erased. When a parent dies, there is a funeral, a grieving process, and eventual closure. But when a parent simply packs a suitcase in the middle of the night and permanently deletes you from their reality, the psychological bleeding never actually stops. To understand the absolute financial annihilation I unleashed upon my father, Richard Vance, we have to go back 15 years. I was 12 years old, living in a modest, middle-class suburban home with my mother. My father was an investment broker, a charming, incredibly charismatic man who always wore expensive watches and drove cars we couldn't really afford. He was the center of my universe. I worshipped the ground he walked on, completely unaware that his entire existence was a carefully constructed, sociopathic lie. The illusion violently shattered on a Tuesday morning in November. I woke up for school, walked down to the kitchen, and found my mother sitting on the floor, holding a piece of paper, weeping so hysterically she couldn't even catch her breath. My father was gone. His closet was completely empty. His golf clubs were missing. He had left a typed, pathetic one-paragraph note on the kitchen island claiming that his investment firm had catastrophically collapsed, that he was millions of dollars in debt to dangerous people, and that he had to disappear immediately to keep us safe. He explicitly wrote that we should never try to contact him for our own protection. As a 12-year-old girl, I was terrified for his life. I spent the next 6 months crying myself to sleep, praying that my father was safe from whatever imaginary mafia he was running from. But the truth was infinitely more disgusting than a dramatic mafia escape. My father didn't run from dangerous creditors. He ran from us. Over the next year, the brutal reality of his business collapse destroyed our lives. He hadn't just abandoned us. He had systematically drained every single joint bank account, liquidated my college fund, and taken out 3 massive secondary mortgages on our family home using my mother's forged signature. He stole over $400,000 in liquid cash, leaving my mother holding the bag for all of his manufactured debt. The bank foreclosed on our house 6 months later. My mother, a gentle woman who had spent 15 years as a stay-at-home mom, was suddenly forced to work 3 minimum-wage jobs just to keep us from sleeping on the streets. We moved into a tiny, roach-infested apartment in the worst part of the city. I spent my teenage years wearing thrift store clothes, eating cheap ramen noodles, and watching my mother physically deteriorate from exhaustion. She aged 20 years in the span of 5. She developed severe chronic arthritis from scrubbing floors, her spirit completely broken by the man she had trusted with her life. But the absolute breaking point, the exact moment the 12-year-old girl died and the financial predator was born, happened when I was 16. I was using a public library computer for a high school project, and out of sheer, desperate curiosity, I typed my father's name into a search engine. I didn't expect to find anything, but there he was. He wasn't hiding from the mafia in a third-world country. He was featured in a high-society digital magazine spread, smiling brilliantly, holding a glass of champagne on a massive private yacht. The headline read, "Prominent wealth consultant Richard Vance and his new wife, heiress Victoria Sterling, host annual charity gala." I clicked through the photos, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the mouse. There were pictures of his massive new mansion in a different state. There were pictures of his two new, perfectly dressed stepchildren. He had literally stolen our entire net worth to manufacture a high-class persona, allowing him to successfully seduce and marry into a multi-million-dollar family. He had completely replaced us. He traded my mother's sanity and my childhood for a yacht and a wealthy socialite. Sitting in that quiet library, looking at the man who had condemned us to poverty smiling on a multi-million-dollar boat, I experienced a fundamental chemical shift in my brain. If you scream at a toxic narcissist, they just call you crazy. I realized that the only language a man like Richard Vance understood was money. I didn't tell my mother what I found. It would have literally killed her. Instead, I closed the web browser, walked out of the library, and made a silent, unbreakable vow. I wasn't just going to confront him. I was going to learn everything about his world. I was going to study the exact financial systems he used to hide his money. I was going to become the apex predator of the banking world. And one day, I was going to find his secret vault, and I was going to legally strip every single stolen penny from his hands. Hate is a remarkably efficient fuel source. It doesn't require sleep, it doesn't require validation, and it completely eradicates the concept of burnout. For the next 10 years, I essentially weaponized my trauma. I didn't go to college parties. I didn't date. I worked 3 exhausting jobs to put myself through a rigorous forensic accounting program at a top-tier university. While my peers were studying standard corporate tax law, I was obsessively reading case studies on international money laundering, offshore shell companies, and high-net-worth asset concealment. I needed to understand exactly how monsters like my father moved their money in the dark. By the time I was 26, I had graduated at the top of my class, passed my CPA exams with flawless scores, and aggressively leveraged my way into a junior auditing position at Kensington & Lowe, one of the most elite, ruthless wealth management firms in the country. Our firm didn't cater to middle-class families. We managed the portfolios of multimillionaires, aggressive hedge funds, and generational heirs. We were the people who knew where the absolute wealthiest individuals on the planet hid their money, and I was incredibly good at my job. I had a supernatural ability to spot financial anomalies, tracing hidden assets through layers of dummy corporations and complex trust funds. I climbed the corporate ladder with terrifying speed. By the time I was 30, I was promoted to senior financial auditor, the youngest person in the firm's history to hold the title. I was given unilateral authority over high-risk, ultra-wealthy portfolios. My mother thought my success was driven by a desire to secure our future, to ensure we never had to worry about rent again. She was incredibly proud of the comfortable house I had finally bought for her, but she didn't know that my entire career was simply a hunting expedition. I was waiting in the tall grass for my father. Richard Vance had spent the last decade living like royalty. He had successfully embedded himself into his new wife's multi-million-dollar family, branding himself as a boutique wealth consultant. But from the quiet, relentless background checks I ran on him using my firm's incredibly powerful proprietary software, I knew the truth. Richard wasn't a financial genius. He was a parasite. His new wife's family possessed massive, generational wealth, but they were incredibly arrogant and fundamentally lazy with their accounting. Richard had convinced them to let him manage a massive portion of their liquid assets. And true to his sociopathic nature, he wasn't just managing it. He was secretly skimming off the top. He was systematically siphoning millions of dollars from his new wife's family trust and hiding it in complex, offshore dummy accounts in the Cayman Islands. He was stealing from them exactly like he had stolen from us, just on a much grander, more sophisticated scale. But Richard had a massive logistical problem. The IRS was beginning to crack down heavily on unreported offshore accounts. The international tax loopholes he was exploiting were rapidly closing. He needed to repatriate those stolen millions back into the United States, wash the money through a legitimate corporate entity, and legitimize his secret wealth before the federal government noticed the discrepancies. He needed a top-tier, absolutely discreet wealth management firm to execute the transfer. He needed a firm that specialized in handling high-risk, offshore restructuring without asking moral questions. He needed Kensington & Lowe. The trap essentially set itself. One Tuesday afternoon, my managing partner walked into my office and handed me a thick, confidential client intake file. "Elena," my boss said, looking incredibly serious, "we just landed a massive potential client, a high-net-worth consultant looking to repatriate roughly $12 million from some very aggressively structured Cayman trusts. It's a highly sensitive portfolio. The client specifically requested our absolute best auditor to handle the restructuring. I'm assigning the account to you." I took the file from his hands. I didn't even have to open it to know who it was. The universe has a profoundly dark sense of humor. I waited until my boss left the office before I finally flipped open the manila folder. I stared at the intake sheet. Client name, Richard Vance. Net worth estimated, $15 million. Reason for consultation, offshore trust restructuring. He had no idea that I worked at Kensington and Lowe. I used my mother's maiden name professionally, completely erasing the Vance surname from my identity years ago. He thought he was walking into a sterile, corporate sanctuary to protect his stolen millions. He didn't realize he had just voluntarily handed the keys to his entire financial existence directly to the daughter he had left to starve. I closed the folder, locked the door to my office, and began to build the guillotine. The preparation for the execution required absolute, flawless precision. I spent the entire weekend inside the firm's secure servers, meticulously analyzing the preliminary financial data Richard had submitted for his intake. It was exactly as I had suspected. The 3 Cayman Island trusts weren't just sophisticated tax shelters. They were massive, illegal holding pens for the money he had been systematically siphoning from his new wife's family estate. He had used a web of incredibly complex shell companies, but he made a few arrogant, sloppy mistakes. They were the kind of mistakes a junior IRS agent might miss, but a forensic auditor would spot instantly. To legally restructure those accounts, Richard was going to have to sign a comprehensive power of attorney for financial restructuring. That document would grant me, as his lead auditor, unilateral legal authority to freeze, move, or report those assets if I suspected financial crimes. He was literally walking into a federal trap of his own making. On Thursday morning, exactly at 10:00 a.m., my assistant notified me that Mr. Vance had arrived. I reserved the firm's executive glass boardroom, a room designed specifically to intimidate. I wore a tailored, dark charcoal suit, tied my hair back into a severe bun, and put on a pair of sharp, wire-rimmed glasses. I didn't look anything like the terrified, malnourished 12-year-old girl he had abandoned. I looked like corporate death. I walked into the boardroom and sat at the head of the massive obsidian table, opening his file. A moment later, the heavy glass doors opened. Richard Vance walked in. It had been 15 years, but the fundamental core of his arrogance hadn't changed. He looked older, his hair graying at the temples, but he was wearing a bespoke Italian suit, a $60,000 Patek Philippe watch, and that same manufactured sociopathic smile. He walked into the room completely confident, utterly unaware that he had just stepped into a financial slaughterhouse. He extended his hand across the table. "Good morning, Richard Vance," he said, oozing synthetic charm. "You must be the senior auditor. They told me you were the absolute best in the firm." "I'm looking forward to working with you." I didn't shake his hand. I simply looked at it until he awkwardly pulled it back. "Please sit down, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "My time is incredibly valuable, so we are going to bypass the corporate pleasantries and get directly to the architecture of your offshore trusts." He blinked, slightly unnerved by my absolute lack of deference to his perceived wealth, but he quickly recovered, pulling out a chair and sitting down with a heavy sigh. "Of course," he chuckled nervously. "I appreciate a professional who gets straight to business. As you can see from my file, my wife's family possesses significant generational assets. I have been quietly migrating a portion of my personal consulting fees into 3 Cayman trusts for, let's call it, tax efficiency. However, with the new federal banking regulations, my current offshore managers are getting nervous. I need Kensington and Lowe to assume control of the trusts, repatriate the $12 million, and restructure it into a legitimate domestic holding company without triggering a federal audit." I looked at him, feeling an intense, burning wave of absolute disgust. He was sitting there, casually asking me to launder $12 million he had stolen from his second family, completely oblivious to the fact that he had destroyed his first family for pennies compared to this. "The architecture of your current offshore setup is remarkably sloppy, Mr. Vance," I stated clinically, sliding a printed diagram of his shell companies across the table. "You have commingled personal funds with corporate assets, which instantly pierces the corporate veil. If the IRS were to subpoena these records today, they wouldn't just seize the $12 million, they would indict you for federal wire fraud and tax evasion." All the color instantly drained from Richard's face. The arrogant smile completely vanished. He leaned forward, genuine panic flashing in his eyes. "Can you fix it?" he whispered, suddenly realizing he was not the smartest man in the room. "Can you protect the money?" "I can restructure the entire portfolio," I replied smoothly, projecting the exact aura of a ruthless, high-priced corporate mercenary. "But to execute the domestic transfer and shield the assets from federal scrutiny, I need absolute, unilateral control over the Cayman accounts. You will need to sign a complete financial power of attorney, transferring executive management of the $12 million directly to me. Once the ink is dry, I will initiate the protocol to freeze the offshore accounts, sanitize the capital, and move it." I pulled out a thick stack of legally binding documents, flipping to the final signature page, and placed my heavy gold pen on top of it. I slid it precisely across the obsidian table until it stopped right in front of him. This was the point of no return. If he signed that paper, he was legally handing his entire stolen fortune, his freedom, and his completely manufactured second life directly into the hands of the daughter he threw away. Richard stared at the contract. He hesitated for 5 agonizing seconds, his greed warring with his paranoia. But his desperation to protect his secret millions completely overpowered his caution. He picked up the gold pen. He didn't read the fine print. He didn't ask questions. He quickly signed his name on the dotted line, sealing his own execution. I watched the dark ink dry on the signature line. The sound of the heavy gold pen scratching against the paper was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. Richard let out a heavy, dramatic sigh of relief, leaning back in his expensive leather chair as if he had just defused a bomb. He genuinely believed he had just hired the most brilliant financial mercenary in the city to protect his parasitic existence. He watched calmly as I pulled the thick contract back across the obsidian table, picked up my own pen, and applied my official corporate auditor seal and countersignature. The legal transfer of power was now absolute and irrevocable. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply reached over to my Secure Firm laptop, typed in my high-level executive credentials, and accessed the international banking portal linked to his 3 Cayman Island trusts. With 3 precise keystrokes, I initiated the code red asset freeze protocol. On the screen, the $12 million in liquid capital instantly changed from active green to a locked, inaccessible red status. I closed the laptop. "Excellent," Richard said, adjusting his custom silk tie, completely oblivious to the digital execution that had just occurred. "So, how long until the funds are safely restructured into the domestic holding company?" My wife's family is starting to ask questions about the missing capital, and I need to show them a clean, diversified portfolio by the end of the month. I took off my wire-rimmed glasses, placed them slowly on the table, and finally looked at him. I didn't look at him with the neutral, polite gaze of a corporate auditor. I looked at him with the absolute, agonizing weight of 15 years of poverty, starvation, and betrayal. "The funds are never moving into a domestic holding company, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice completely stripped of its professional cadence, dropping into a tone of pure, lethal ice. Richard frowned, clearly confused by the sudden shift in my demeanor. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. We just signed the agreement. You said you were going to sanitize the capital." "I lied," I stated simply. "Exactly 3 seconds ago, utilizing the comprehensive power of attorney you just willingly signed, I initiated a complete federal freeze on all 3 of your offshore Cayman accounts. You no longer have access to a single penny of those $12 million. Furthermore, as a licensed fiduciary bound by strict federal banking regulations, I have legally flagged those accounts under the Anti-Money Laundering Act. An automated dossier containing the entire architecture of your shell companies, your illegal tax evasion, and your direct embezzlement from your new wife's family trust has just been transmitted to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. The confusion on Richard's face violently morphed into sheer, unadulterated terror. He gripped the edge of the glass table, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the concrete. "Are you insane?" he screamed, his voice cracking hysterically, his composed high society mask shattering into pieces. "You can't do that. You are my auditor. You are bound by corporate confidentiality. I will sue this entire firm into the ground. I will have you disbarred and thrown in federal prison." "There is no confidentiality privilege when a client explicitly uses a firm to commit an active federal crime," I replied smoothly, completely unmoved by his violent outburst. "And you aren't going to sue anyone, Richard, because to sue me, you would have to go to federal court and publicly admit that you stole $12 million from your heiress wife. Your new family would instantly destroy you. You are completely, financially paralyzed." Richard stared at me, his chest heaving, his brain violently short-circuiting as he desperately tried to figure out why a top-tier auditor was intentionally sabotaging her own career just to destroy him. "Why?" He choked out, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "Why are you doing this to me? I don't even know you." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold glass table. I looked directly into his panicked, pathetic eyes, letting the corporate facade drop completely. "Look closely at my face, Richard," I whispered, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the boardroom. "Strip away the corporate suit, strip away the 15 years, look at my eyes. Do you really not recognize the daughter you left to starve in a roach-infested apartment so you could buy a yacht?" The blood instantly drained from his face. His mouth fell open in a silent scream of absolute horror as the realization finally, violently hit him. "Elena," he breathed out, the name sounding like shattered glass in his throat. "Hello, Dad," I replied coldly. "Welcome to the audit." The absolute silence in the boardroom was so profound it felt like a vacuum. Richard sat paralyzed in his expensive leather chair, staring at me as if I were a ghost that had just crawled out of a grave he dug 15 years ago. His eyes darted wildly across my face, desperately searching for the terrified, worshipful 12-year-old girl he had abandoned. He found absolutely nothing but cold, corporate steel. When the initial shock finally began to wear off, the pure, unadulterated narcissism that defined his entire existence kicked in. Instead of begging for forgiveness, he immediately attempted to deploy the exact same manipulative charm he had used to destroy my mother. "Elena," he whispered, his voice trembling as he forced a pathetic, watery smile onto his face. "My God, look at you. You're so grown up. You're brilliant. I always knew you were going to be something special." I didn't blink. I just stared at him, letting his pathetic attempt at fatherly pride die in the freezing air between us. "You don't understand what happened back then, sweetheart," he continued, leaning forward across the table, his tone dripping with manufactured desperation. "I was in deep trouble. The market crashed. I had dangerous creditors threatening me. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left to protect you and your mother. I had to disappear so they wouldn't come after you." I slowly picked up my heavy gold pen and tapped it once against the glass table. "You took out 3 secondary mortgages using my mother's forged signature, Richard," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You liquidated my college fund. You drained the joint checking accounts of $400,000 in cash. You didn't run from creditors. You funded your escape. You left my mother with massive, fraudulent debt. She worked 3 minimum wage jobs until the cartilage in her knees completely deteriorated just to keep me from starving. So do not sit in my boardroom and insult my intelligence by playing the sacrificial protector." The fake, loving father facade instantly shattered. His face hardened, the desperate charm evaporating into raw, cornered panic. He realized that the emotional manipulation wasn't going to work on the apex predator sitting across from him. So he pivoted to the only language he actually respected: bribery. "Okay." "Okay, listen to me," he stammered, frantically wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. "You're angry, you have every right to be angry, but let's be rational. You are holding $12 million. That's a massive amount of capital, Elena. You don't have to give it to the IRS. You can unfreeze the Cayman accounts right now. If you do, I will wire $6 million into a private account for you and your mother today. Half of everything. $6 million untraceable. You'll never have to work another day in your life. We can fix this right now." He stared at me with wide, desperate eyes, genuinely believing that his stolen money could buy his way out of the execution. I felt a cold, authentic smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey step willingly into the final snare. "You fundamentally misunderstand the dynamic of this room, Richard," I replied softly, leaning back in my chair. "I am the youngest senior auditor in the history of Kensington and Low. My annual compensation package is well over 7 figures. I bought my mother a beautiful house in the suburbs 3 years ago. She has a private live-in nurse. I don't need your dirty, stolen money. I have already built my own empire." I reached over to the table, picked up his confidential intake file, and dropped it into the secure, locked shredding bin next to my desk. "And more importantly, you fundamentally misunderstand the architecture of a federal freeze," I continued, watching the last sliver of hope physically leave his body. "I didn't just lock the accounts. The automated IRS transfer protocol I initiated cannot be canceled, not even by me. It is a one-way digital tripwire. The federal agents are currently reviewing the dossier of your shell companies. By the time you walk out of this building, they will be drafting the arrest warrants." He collapsed back into his chair, gasping for air as if the oxygen had literally been sucked out of the room. He was completely, utterly ruined. But I wasn't finished. I wanted him to understand exactly how much worse his day was about to get. The realization that the IRS was already processing his federal arrest warrant left Richard practically catatonic. He sat frozen in the boardroom chair, staring blankly at the obsidian table, his breathing shallow and rapid. But the absolute destruction of his financial freedom was only the first phase of my execution. The second phase was designed to eradicate the false, luxurious identity he had sacrificed my mother to build. "You think the federal government is your biggest problem right now, Richard?" I asked, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes wide and hollow. "The IRS will take your money. They will sentence you to a minimum security white-collar prison. You will serve 5 to 7 years, and then you will eventually get out. But what happens to you after you get out is what truly matters." I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed courier envelope. I didn't hand it to him. I simply held it up so he could see the premium gold wax seal of Kensington and Low stamped on the back. "When you sat in that chair and asked me to restructure the capital you stole from the Sterling Family Trust, you triggered a highly specific corporate protocol," I explained, maintaining absolute, clinical eye contact. "As a licensed fiduciary, if I discover that a client is actively embezzling funds from a generational estate, I have a strict, legal obligation to notify the primary beneficiaries of that estate to prevent further financial liability to our firm." Richard's eyes locked onto the envelope, a new, much deeper kind of terror washing over his face. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking violently. "No, Alina, please, you didn't." "I did," I confirmed coldly. "Exactly 1 hour before you walked into this building, I dispatched a private corporate courier to the primary estate of Arthur Sterling, your father-in-law. I didn't just send him a warning. I sent him a complete, unredacted duplicate of the exact same financial dossier I sent to the IRS. I gave him the routing numbers, the Cayman account details, and the exact dates you actively siphoned millions from his family's legacy." Richard let out a guttural, agonizing sound, completely burying his face in his trembling hands. The Sterling family wasn't just wealthy. They were incredibly powerful, notoriously ruthless old money billionaires. They had teams of aggressive corporate lawyers who destroyed people for sport. "They are going to crucify me," Richard sobbed into his hands, his manufactured high society persona completely disintegrating into dust. "Arthur is going to destroy me. Victoria will divorce me. They will leave me with absolutely nothing." "They already have," I stated smoothly. "Arthur Sterling's lead attorney called my private line 20 minutes ago to confirm receipt of the dossier. He informed me that Victoria's security team has already deactivated your access codes to the mansion. Your private credit cards have been frozen, and your personal belongings are currently being boxed up and placed on the curb outside the estate gates. You aren't just going to prison, Richard. You are going to prison as a completely homeless, divorced, hated man." He pulled his face out of his hands, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. The illusion of the loving father was entirely gone, replaced by the cornered, vicious parasite he truly was. "You are a monster," he hissed, his face red and contorted with rage. "I am the architect of my own survival," I corrected him, standing up from my chair and buttoning my suit jacket. "You built a glass castle on the foundation of my mother's suffering. I simply threw the first stone. You have exactly 2 minutes to vacate this boardroom before I call building security to physically drag you out onto the street. Enjoy the walk home. Richard. I hear the public bus system is incredibly reliable this time of day." I didn't wait for him to respond. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on the man who had destroyed my childhood, and walked out of the glass doors, leaving him entirely alone with the catastrophic ruins of his existence. Walking out of that boardroom was the lightest I had felt in 15 years. The air in the hallway felt crisper. The sunlight hitting the glass walls of the skyscraper felt warmer. And for the first time since I was 12 years old, the constant, low-frequency hum of anxiety in my chest had finally gone silent. But for Richard Vance, the nightmare was only in its opening act. As I sat in my private office and watched the security feed of the lobby, I saw Richard stumble out of the elevator. He didn't look like a millionaire consultant anymore. He looked like a man who had just survived a high-speed train wreck. He was pale, his tie was undone, and his hands were shaking so violently he could barely push the revolving doors open. I knew exactly what he was going to do. He was going to call Victoria. He was going to try to lie, to manipulate, to spin some pathetic story about a corporate misunderstanding. I watched him pull out his expensive smartphone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. He stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes, the phone pressed to his ear, his face contorting in a mixture of pleading and terror. He didn't know that Victoria Sterling's lawyers had already instructed her to never speak to him again. Every single one of his calls was being diverted to a high-powered legal firm that specialized in asset recovery and domestic annihilation. By 3:00 p.m. that afternoon, the Sterling family's response was swift and merciless. They didn't just want a divorce, they wanted a total erasure. Because Richard had used the Sterling family name to secure his shell companies, Arthur Sterling utilized his massive political influence to ensure that the federal investigation was expedited. By 5:00 p.m., a team of 4 IRS agents and 2 federal marshals arrived at the Sterling estate. They weren't there to talk, they were there to seize. They didn't find Richard at the mansion because, as I had predicted, he was barred from the property. He was currently sitting in a cheap, greasy diner 3 blocks away, staring at a cup of cold coffee he couldn't afford to pay for, watching the local news on a wall-mounted television. He watched, paralyzed, as the news anchor reported on a massive federal fraud investigation involving a local wealth consultant. They showed footage of the federal agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the Sterling estate. They showed the marshals towing away the luxury yacht where he had hosted those arrogant champagne galas. His entire manufactured world was being dismantled in 4K resolution on every television screen in the city. But the most satisfying part of the afternoon wasn't the news report. It was the phone call I made to my mother. I didn't tell her about the boardroom. I didn't tell her about the federal freeze. I simply told her that I had finally closed the largest, most difficult account of my career and that I was coming home early to take her out to dinner. When I arrived at the house I had bought for her, she was sitting in the garden, looking peaceful. For 15 years, she had carried the weight of his betrayal, the shame of being discarded like trash. I sat down next to her, took her hand, and for the first time, I felt like the debt had been paid in full. I had taken the $12 million he stole from others to pay for the childhood he stole from me. And while the IRS was busy liquidating his assets, I knew that the legal proceedings would eventually lead to a massive victim restitution fund. Because of the way I had structured the federal flag, my mother was legally positioned as the primary victim of his initial identity fraud and mortgage theft. The government wasn't just going to put him in jail. They were going to funnel a significant portion of his liquidated assets directly into a trust fund for her. Richard thought he was hiding money from the government. He didn't realize he was just building a massive retirement fund for the woman he left for dead. The golden child of the Sterling family was gone. The parasite was officially being purged, and the daughter he forgot was the only person left standing in the ruins. The diner was cold, smelled of stale grease, and was filled with the kind of people Richard Vance used to consider invisible. He sat in a corner booth, his hands still trembling so violently that he spilled the cold coffee onto his wrinkled silk shirt. Every time the bell above the door chimed, he flinched, convinced it was the federal marshals coming to end his life. But the true agony wasn't the police. It was the silence of his phone. He had called Victoria 32 times. He had called his stepchildren, the ones he had bought with my mother's stolen money. Not a single person answered. To the Sterling family, Richard Vance wasn't a husband or a father anymore. He was a viral infection that needed to be surgically removed. At exactly 6:30 p.m., the diner doors swung open, but it wasn't the police. It was Victoria Sterling herself, flanked by 2 massive private security guards and her lead divorce attorney. She didn't look like the grieving, betrayed wife. She looked like an empress coming to inspect a dead insect. Richard scrambled to his feet, a pathetic, hopeful look crossing his face. "Victoria, thank God," he stammered, reaching out toward her. "It's all a mistake. The auditor, she's insane. She's my daughter from a previous life, she's obsessed. She's lying about everything." Victoria didn't let him get within 3 feet. Her security guards stepped forward, their presence an immovable wall. She looked at Richard with a level of disgust that was so cold it was almost physical. "The auditor didn't have to lie, Richard," Victoria said, her voice echoing in the quiet diner. "My father's forensic team spent the last 4 hours cross-referencing the dossier she sent us with our internal ledgers. You didn't just restructure our money. You stole $12.4 million from my children's inheritance trusts. You used my family's legacy to fund offshore accounts for your own twisted exit strategy." "I did it for us," Richard cried out, the desperation in his voice making the other diners turn and stare. "I wanted to make sure we were always taken care of," Victoria laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "You did it for yourself. You are a common, low-level thief who got lucky for a few years." "My father is currently on the phone with the district attorney. We aren't just filing for divorce, Richard. We are testifying against you. We are going to ensure that you stay in a federal cell until you are too old to remember your own name." She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a heavy gold wedding band, and dropped it into his cold cup of coffee. "The mansion is cleared. Your cars are gone. Your accounts are seized. You have absolutely nothing left in this world but the clothes on your back. Don't ever let me see your face again." She turned and walked out, leaving Richard standing in the middle of the diner, staring at the gold ring sinking into the murky brown liquid. He was a man who had traded everything for a lie, and now even the lie had abandoned him. 10 minutes later, 2 black SUVs pulled up to the curb. The federal marshals stepped out, their badges glinting under the neon diner sign. They didn't have to search for him. Richard was still standing by the booth, completely broken, his spirit already dead. They pushed him against the glass window, the same window that showed the local news still looping the footage of his life being dismantled. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Richard didn't fight. He didn't protest. He just looked at his reflection in the glass, and for the first time in 15 years, he saw the coward he truly was. I watched the entire arrest through a live feed from my investigator. I sat in my darkened office, the city lights shimmering behind me, and I felt a profound sense of justice. He had left us in the dark. It was only fitting that he went into his new cage in the dark. The daughter he discarded had just finished the job the world had been waiting for. Richard Vance was no longer a millionaire, a husband, or a consultant. He was now just federal inmate number 49,210. The federal detention center smelled of industrial-strength bleach and stale, recycled air. It was a sensory nightmare designed to strip away every ounce of human dignity. For a man who had spent the last 15 years surrounded by the scent of expensive leather, sea salt on private yachts, and $500 cologne, this gray, sterile box was a living hell. I sat behind the reinforced glass in the visitation room, wearing a simple but impeccably tailored black dress. I didn't bring a lawyer. I didn't bring a file. I just brought myself. When the heavy steel door at the far end of the room opened, I barely recognized the man who walked out. Richard Vance was gone. In his place was a frail, hunched-over inmate in a faded orange jumpsuit. His skin was sallow. His hair had turned completely white in the 6 months since his arrest, and the manufactured confidence that once defined his walk had been replaced by a cautious, defeated shuffle. He sat down on the plastic stool, picking up the heavy telephone receiver with a trembling hand. He looked at me through the glass, his eyes welling up with tears that were a pathetic mixture of genuine terror and manipulative self-pity. "Alina," he whispered into the phone, his voice sounding thin and raspy. "I didn't think you'd come. I've been writing letters. I've been praying you'd give me a chance to explain, to truly apologize." I looked at him, my expression as flat and unyielding as the concrete walls around us. I didn't pick up my receiver for a full minute, forcing him to sit in the suffocating silence of his own consequences. Finally, I lifted the phone. "I didn't come here for an apology, Richard," I said, my voice echoing coldly in his ear. "An apology is a social contract between equals. We are not equals. I came here to give you a final update on the audit of your life." Richard closed his eyes, a sob escaping his chest. "The lawyers told me about the Sterling lawsuit," he choked out. "They're taking everything. They even went after the small offshore account I had set aside for my retirement. I'm going to die in here with nothing, Alina, my new family. They won't even accept my collect calls." Victoria filed for an annulment based on fraud. It's like I never even existed to them. "That's the nature of being a parasite, Richard," I replied, leaning slightly forward toward the glass. "When the host realizes what you are, they don't just leave, they sanitize. But I wanted you to know exactly where the $12 million is going. You spent a decade skillfully siphoning that money from the Sterling trusts. You worked so hard to hide it, to wash it, to build a vault for your own greed. You thought you were building a legacy for yourself." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle into the room. "The Federal Restitution Fund has officially been finalized. Because I provided the IRS with the proof that your initial wealth was built on the identity theft and mortgage fraud committed against my mother, the court has ruled that she is the primary victim of your criminal history. Every single penny that the government liquidates from your Sterling accounts, your hidden assets, and your seized properties is being funneled directly into a specialized, irrevocable trust for her." Richard's eyes widened, his mouth falling open in a silent gasp. The realization that his decade of hard work and theft was now directly funding the life of the woman he had discarded was a psychological blow he couldn't sustain. "So in a way, I should thank you," I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal, mocking whisper. "You worked 15 years to ensure that my mother would live the rest of her life in absolute luxury. She has the best doctors. She has the best home. She has total financial security. You were never a brilliant consultant, Richard. You were just an unpaid intern working for my mother's retirement fund. You spent your life building a throne, and I just made sure she was the one sitting on it." Richard let out a guttural, broken cry, slamming his fist against the plexiglass. "You're a monster," he wailed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and absolute, soul-crushing defeat. "I'm your father. I gave you life. You gave me a cardboard box and a hunger that never goes away," I corrected him, standing up from the stool. "And now I am giving you exactly what you gave us, absolute, permanent silence." I hung up the phone. I didn't look back as the guards grabbed him by the arms to lead him back to his cell. I walked out of the prison gates and into the bright, open sunlight, breathing in the air of a world where Richard Vance no longer had any power. The audit was officially closed. The true measure of a successful audit isn't just finding the missing numbers. It is restoring the balance to the universe. 6 months after my final meeting with Richard in the Federal Detention Center, the legal dust finally settled. The federal government, working in coordination with the Sterling family's aggressive legal team, completed the liquidation of every single asset Richard Vance had ever touched. His luxury mansion was sold to a private tech firm. His offshore accounts were drained to satisfy the multi-million-dollar restitution orders. And because of the ironclad evidence I provided of his initial fraud against my mother, the court-appointed trustee signed the final transfer of the Victim Compensation Fund. I sat on the back porch of my mother's house on a warm Sunday evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. My mother was sitting in her favorite armchair, a soft blanket over her lap, reading a book. She looked younger than she had in decades. The constant, physical tension of survival had completely evaporated from her shoulders. She didn't know the full extent of what I had done in that boardroom. She didn't know about the secret millions or the strategic trap I had spent 15 years building. To her, justice had simply arrived in the form of a legal settlement that ensured she would never have to worry about a bill ever again. She looked up from her book and smiled at me, a genuine, peaceful smile that was worth more than every penny in the Sterling trusts. "It's so quiet out here, Alina," she said softly. "I used to think that the silence was a bad thing, that it meant we were alone, but now it just feels like peace." I took a sip of my tea, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. "Silence is a luxury, Mom," I replied, "and you've earned it." As for Richard, the world moved on with brutal efficiency. Once the Sterling family had finished erasing him from their history, he became a nonentity. No one visited him. No one wrote to him. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the reflected glow of other people's wealth, and now that the light had been extinguished, he was just a shadow in an orange jumpsuit. He would spend the next decade of his life as a number, forgotten by the families he betrayed and discarded by the society he tried so desperately to infiltrate. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty. They ask if blood shouldn't count for something, even after a betrayal that deep. My answer is always the same. A father is not a biological fact. A father is a choice. Richard Vance chose to be a thief. He chose to be a ghost. I simply chose to be the person who held him accountable for those choices. My name is Alina. I didn't scream, I didn't beg for an apology, and I didn't wait for karma to eventually find him. I became the karma. I studied his world, I mastered his language, and I used his own greed to fund the life he tried to destroy. The audit of the Vance family is officially closed, and for the first time in my life, the books are perfectly balanced. If you enjoyed this massive 10-part saga of betrayal and financial revenge, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Revenge Room. Your support allows us to keep bringing these stories of justice to life. Never let a toxic person convince you that their mistakes are your burden to carry. Build your own empire, protect your peace, and always keep your receipts. See you in the next one.